April 5, 1945. Off the coast of Sakishima Gunto, southwest of Okinawa, Commander Takeshi Yamada stood on the listing deck of the carrier Shinano's escort destroyer, watching British corsairs and Avengers circle overhead like patient vultures. The water around him was thick with oil and debris, all that remained of Japan's newest fleet carrier, torpedoed and sinking despite armor that was supposed to make her unsinkable. 3 British Avengers from HMS Indomitable had delivered the killing strikes, their torpedoes penetrating defenses that Japanese engineers had calculated as impervious. Yamada's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the collapse of certainty. For 4 years, Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed the British Fleet Air Arm as a ceremonial force. Obsolete carriers with inadequate aircraft, inferior tactics, pilots trained for European waters who would wilt against Japanese naval aviation's combat-hardened superiority. The assessment had been institutional gospel, repeated at the Naval Staff College, echoed through fleet exercises, embedded in operational planning. Yet here he stood, watching British carrier aircraft demonstrate what Japanese confidence had refused to acknowledge, that Britain had been learning while Japan had been assuming, adapting while Japan had been celebrating, and preparing a reckoning that was only now becoming visible through smoke and sinking steel. The Imperial Japanese Navy of 1941 approached the Pacific War with justified confidence in its carrier aviation capabilities. Japanese carrier doctrine, developed through years of combat experience in China and refined through intensive training, represented the most advanced naval aviation thinking of the era. The Kido Butai, the striking force of 6 fleet carriers, could project power across vast distances, launch coordinated multi-carrier strikes, and recover aircraft in weather conditions that would ground Western naval aviation. Japanese pilots trained until carrier operations became instinctive, until they could land on pitching decks in darkness, until instrument flying was as natural as breathing. The Zero fighter dominated early Pacific skies. The Kate torpedo bomber and Val dive bomber were proven, lethal weapons systems. Japanese naval aviation wasn't merely competent, it was, by any objective measure in 1941, the world's finest. Against this excellence, the British Fleet Air Arm appeared hopelessly outmatched. British carriers were smaller than their American or Japanese counterparts, carried fewer aircraft, and operated what Japanese intelligence assessed as obsolete equipment. The Fairey Swordfish, a fabric-covered biplane torpedo bomber, seemed laughably archaic compared to sleek Japanese Kates. British fighters like the Fulmar were slower and less maneuverable than the Zero. British carrier doctrine emphasized fleet protection rather than offensive striking power, a defensive mentality that Japanese staff officers interpreted as strategic timidity, born from European thinking, unsuited to Pacific distances and intensity. Intelligence reports compiled by the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Division in late 1941 characterized the British Eastern Fleet as a collection of obsolescent vessels manned by personnel with limited combat experience against first-rate opponents. The assessment wasn't entirely wrong. Britain's best carriers and most experienced crews were in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. What reached the Indian Ocean were older ships, crews rotated from other theaters, aircraft that were indeed outdated by Pacific standards. But what Japanese intelligence fundamentally misunderstood, or perhaps refused to understand, was that British naval aviation had been continuously at war since 1939, fighting Germans and Italians in conditions that forged different skills than Pacific operations required, but skills that were no less valuable for being different. The Japanese assessment contained a deeper, more dangerous assumption that European naval powers, having dominated global seas for centuries, were inherently inferior to Asian naval forces who understood Asian waters, Asian distances, Asian operational tempo. This wasn't mere tactical assessment, it was civilizational confidence that would prove catastrophically expensive. Britain, they believed, would wilt before Japanese naval superiority, just as European colonial powers had wilted throughout Asia. The assessment was precise, confident, and comprehensively wrong. The first cracks in Japanese confidence appeared not in battle but in intelligence analysis that contradicted institutional assumptions, and was therefore dismissed. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the Imperial Navy's most brilliant tactical minds, reviewed British carrier operations against the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940, and saw something his superiors missed. 21 Swordfish biplanes, launched at night from HMS Illustrious, had penetrated Taranto harbor's defenses and crippled the Italian battleship fleet with torpedo attacks delivered with precision that stunned even British commanders. The operation demonstrated sophisticated night carrier operations, detailed planning, and pilot skill that contradicted the assessment of British aviation as second-rate. Genda's report to the Naval General Staff emphasized these findings, suggesting that British carrier doctrine prioritized different capabilities than Japanese doctrine. Not inferior capabilities, merely different ones. British carriers were designed to operate in confined European waters against land-based air power, which explained their armored flight decks, their smaller air wings, their emphasis on survivability over striking power. British pilots trained for night operations, for attacks through heavy anti-aircraft fire, for combat in weather that would ground Japanese aircraft. These weren't weaknesses. They were specializations suited to different warfare conditions. The Naval General Staff noted Genda's analysis with polite interest and filed it away. The prevailing assessment remained unchanged. British carriers represented minimal threat to Japanese operations. This dismissal wasn't mere bureaucratic inertia. It reflected deeper psychological needs. Japan's entire strategic position in late 1941 depended on the assumption of Japanese naval aviation superiority. Acknowledging that British carriers might be formidable required reconsidering operational plans that were already in motion, questioning assumptions that had achieved consensus, admitting that Asian naval power might not inherently surpass European naval power. It was easier, more comfortable, more psychologically satisfying to maintain existing assessments and dismiss contradictory data as anomalous. The consequences of this intellectual laziness wouldn't become apparent for years. In December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft devastated the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the success seemed to validate every assumption about Japanese superiority. When the Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by Japanese land-based aircraft off Malaya, British naval power in Asian waters appeared broken. When the Indian Ocean raid of April 1942 sent the British Eastern Fleet fleeing before the Kido Butai's power, Japanese naval aviation's dominance seemed absolute. Every victory reinforced confidence, and confidence became certainty, and certainty became dangerous blindness to the reality that Britain was learning, adapting, and preparing countermeasures that Japanese doctrine couldn't imagine, and Japanese pride wouldn't acknowledge. The first genuine confrontation between Japanese and British carrier forces came in April 1942, during the Indian Ocean raid, and it revealed truths that Japanese commanders should have recognized but didn't. Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai, fresh from Pearl Harbor's triumph, entered the Indian Ocean expecting to annihilate the British Eastern Fleet as thoroughly as they had crippled the Americans. Instead, they encountered something unexpected, an enemy that refused decisive battle, that dispersed rather than concentrating, that operated with caution that Japanese doctrine interpreted as cowardice but was actually tactical sophistication. British carriers Hermes, indomitable and formidable, avoided Nagumo's striking force through a combination of intelligence dispersion and operational caution that frustrated Japanese attempts to bring them to decisive battle. When Japanese aircraft finally located and sank Hermes, an old small carrier operating alone, Japanese aviators reported something strange. The British ship had absorbed enormous punishment before sinking, her armored hangar deck and compartmentalized design allowing her to remain afloat far longer than Japanese carriers would have under similar attack. The observation was noted, filed, and forgotten in the broader narrative of Japanese victory. What Japanese commanders missed or chose not to see was that the British Eastern Fleet hadn't been defeated. It had been preserved. Admiral Somerville, commanding British forces, had executed exactly the strategy British Admiralty doctrine prescribed. Avoid decisive engagement against superior forces. Preserve fleet in being status. Trade space for time while waiting for reinforcement in favorable conditions. This was strategic thinking refined through centuries of naval warfare, but to Japanese officers trained to seek and win decisive battle through aggressive action, it appeared as weakness rather than wisdom. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and participated in the Indian Ocean operation, later wrote that Japanese pilots returned from the operation contemptuous of British opposition. Their carriers ran. Their aircraft were obsolete. Their pilots seemed afraid to press attacks. We concluded the British fleet represented no serious threat to Japanese operations. The assessment contained truth, British forces were outmatched in the Indian Ocean in April 1942, but missed the more important reality. Britain was buying time to learn, to adapt, to develop countermeasures, and to deploy them when conditions favored British rather than Japanese strengths. The hubris was comprehensive. Japanese naval aviation had defeated everyone they'd encountered: Americans at Pearl Harbor, British in the Indian Ocean, Americans again at Coral Sea and Midway, though Midway's outcome troubled thoughtful officers. Success had created certainty, and certainty had stopped learning. The British, meanwhile, were studying every engagement, analyzing Japanese tactics, and fundamentally redesigning their carrier aviation doctrine for Pacific warfare. The student was about to teach the master lessons paid for in steel and blood. Between 1942 and 1944, while Japanese naval aviation bled irreplaceable pilots and carriers in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands and Philippine Sea campaigns, British carrier aviation underwent radical transformation. The Fleet Air Arm that would return to the Pacific in 1945 bore little resemblance to the force that had fled the Indian Ocean in 1942. New American-built carriers joined the fleet, illustrious class vessels with armored flight decks and larger air groups. American aircraft replaced obsolete British designs, Corsairs, Hellcats, and Avengers that matched or exceeded Japanese performance. Most critically, British pilots trained specifically for Pacific operations, studying Japanese tactics, learning lessons from American carrier battles, developing countermeasures to Zero fighters and Kate torpedo bombers. The transformation was comprehensive but invisible to Japanese intelligence, which continued operating with 1942 assessments of British capabilities. Part of this blindness was information deficit. Japanese reconnaissance couldn't effectively monitor British naval aviation development in distant theaters, but part was psychological. Having established British inferiority as doctrinal truth, Japanese staff officers discounted reports that contradicted this truth. When intelligence summaries in late 1944 reported British carriers operating in the Indian Ocean with American aircraft and improved tactics, the reports were noted as minor capability enhancement, rather than recognized as fundamental transformation. Captain Okada Tomotsu, serving in the Combined Fleet Intelligence Section, later recalled the institutional resistance to revising British capability assessments. Any officer suggesting British carriers might be formidable was reminded of the Indian Ocean operation. "They ran from us then," senior officers would say. "Why would they be different now?" The assumption was that technological inferiority and tactical timidity were permanent British characteristics, not temporary conditions subject to change. This intellectual rigidity carried material consequences. Japanese carrier doctrine, fleet composition, and tactical planning assumed adversaries would be American carriers. Fast, powerful, with large air groups but vulnerable flight decks. British carriers, with their armored flight decks and different tactical employment, represented a problem Japanese planners hadn't prepared for because they'd convinced themselves it wasn't a problem worth preparing for. The reality was that by early 1945, the British Pacific Fleet represented a threat qualitatively different from American carrier forces. British carriers could absorb punishment that would cripple American flat tops. British pilots trained in European combat conditions brought different tactical thinking than American aviators. British operational doctrine emphasized sustained operations through weather conditions that grounded American carriers. These differences weren't superiority or inferiority. They were different strengths that Japanese doctrine hadn't accounted for because Japanese confidence had declared them irrelevant. The war was about to demonstrate precisely how relevant they were. March 1945. The British Pacific Fleet, designated Task Force 57, arrived at Ulithi Atoll to join American forces preparing for the Okinawa campaign. American naval officers, accustomed to regarding British naval power with the same patronizing affection they might feel toward elderly relatives recounting past glories, were surprised by what they observed. These weren't the obsolescent carriers of 1942. HMS Illustrious, Victorious, Indomitable, and Indefatigable represented modern carrier power, armored flight decks 2 inches thick, air groups of Corsairs and Avengers, crews that had fought through Mediterranean and Norwegian operations. Most significantly, British carriers had survived sustained kamikaze attacks in operations off Sumatra, attacks that would have crippled American carriers but merely dented British armored flight decks. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding American carrier forces, initially proposed assigning British carriers to secondary tasks: fleet protection, escort duties, operations away from primary combat zones. The suggestion wasn't entirely condescending. It reflected genuine concern that British logistical systems couldn't sustain the tempo of American carrier operations. British carriers consumed different fuel, used different ammunition, operated different aircraft maintenance cycles. Integrating them into American task force operations presented genuine challenges, but Admiral Bruce Fraser, commanding British Pacific Fleet, insisted on combat equality. British carriers would undertake the same missions as American carriers, face the same risks, demonstrate their capabilities in action rather than in planning conferences. Fraser was fighting not just the Japanese, but also Allied assumptions about British naval decline. His carriers would prove themselves, or they would at least fail while attempting operations of equal difficulty to American forces. The compromise was Task Force 57's independent assignment, neutralizing Japanese airfields in the Sakishima-Gunto Island chain, preventing Japanese aircraft from staging through those bases to attack American forces at Okinawa. The mission was crucial but secondary, dangerous, but not central. It was exactly the kind of assignment given to capable but not quite trusted allies. Fraser accepted because it gave British carriers operational independence to demonstrate their methods, their capabilities, their resilience. What neither American nor Japanese commanders fully understood was that this assignment played precisely to British carrier strengths. Sustained operations against land-based air power in confined waters, absorbing heavy attack while maintaining operational tempo, fighting in weather conditions that challenged carrier operations. These were exactly the conditions British carriers were designed for and British crews trained to handle. The Sakishima campaign would become an unintended demonstration of what British carrier aviation had become. Not a ceremonial force clinging to past glory, but a formidable instrument of naval power designed for exactly the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that Pacific operations now required. The Sakishima campaign began on March 26, 1945, and immediately demonstrated the gulf between Japanese expectations and British reality. British carriers launched strikes against Japanese airfields on Ishigaki and Miyako Islands, installations that Japanese commanders assumed were safely distant from serious threat, protected by geography and weather, defended by land-based fighters that would massacre obsolete British aircraft attempting attacks. The first British strike arrived precisely on schedule, through weather that had grounded Japanese defensive patrols, delivered with precision that destroyed 23 Japanese aircraft on the ground, and departed before Japanese response could organize. The pattern repeated daily for weeks. British carriers operated in weather conditions, rain squalls, low clouds, rough seas, that American carriers found challenging, and Japanese carriers would have avoided entirely. The armored flight decks that American naval architects dismissed as unnecessary weight proved invaluable. When British carriers recovered aircraft in heavy seas, planes landing hard on pitching decks created impacts that would have damaged wooden American flight decks. British steel merely dented and remained operational. Flight deck crews repaired damage between landing cycles, keeping operations continuous through conditions that would have halted American carrier operations. Japanese defensive response evolved from confident to desperate to simply trying to survive. Initial attacks on British carriers assumed British vessels would be vulnerable to the same kamikaze tactics that had devastated American carriers off the Philippines. The results shocked Japanese pilots who survived. On April 1st, a Zero kamikaze struck HMS Indefatigable's flight deck at full speed, creating an explosion that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. American liaison officers watching from nearby vessels assumed the British carrier was finished. That kind of hit would have sent an American carrier back to Pearl Harbor for months of repairs. Instead, Indefatigable's damage control parties extinguished fires within minutes, repaired the dented flight deck, and resumed flight operations within 2 hours. The demonstration was repeated when HMS Formidable absorbed a kamikaze hit that penetrated her flight deck, something that shouldn't have been possible against 2-inch armor. The impact killed 11 men and created a crater in the flight deck that American observers assumed would end Formidable's operational capability. British crews filled the crater with concrete, covered it with steel plates, and resumed flight operations within 6 hours. An American carrier suffering equivalent damage would have required weeks of shipyard work. British carriers, designed from the beginning to absorb punishment and continue fighting, simply absorbed the punishment and continued fighting. Japanese commanders monitoring these operations began to realize with growing unease that their intelligence assessments of British carrier vulnerability were catastrophically wrong. These weren't obsolete vessels clinging to ceremonial status. These were warships designed from opposite assumptions than Japanese or American carriers, designed to survive rather than to maximize striking power, to sustain operations rather than to deliver overwhelming initial blows. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound and destabilizing. For 4 years, Japanese naval aviation had dominated Pacific skies. American carriers were formidable but vulnerable. Destroy their flight decks, and they withdrew. But British carriers absorbed damage that should have been crippling and simply continued operating. The implications were devastating to Japanese tactical thinking. If kamikaze attacks couldn't neutralize British carriers, what could? Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome, commanding Japanese air forces in the region, wrote in his diary in April 1945, "The British carriers present a problem we have not adequately prepared for. Our pilots report successful attacks, strikes that should cripple American carriers, yet British vessels continue operations with minimal interruption. This suggests either our intelligence regarding British carrier design was incorrect, or British damage control capabilities exceed our assessments. Either explanation is troubling, as our operational planning assumed British carrier vulnerability equivalent to American vessels. The assumption revealed how deeply Japanese overconfidence ran. Japanese carrier doctrine had evolved in the Pacific against American carriers. Every tactic, every weapon, every operational plan assumed American-style carriers with wooden flight decks and unarmored hangars. British carriers, with armored flight decks, closed hangars, and compartmentalized design, represented a different problem requiring different solutions. But Japanese forces in early 1945 lacked the resources, the time, and increasingly the capability to develop those different solutions. Meanwhile, British carrier operations against Sakishima continued with methodical efficiency that contrasted sharply with the desperate intensity of Japanese defensive efforts. British carriers operated in rotating pairs, 2 carriers launching strikes while 2 withdrew for replenishment, creating sustained pressure that Japanese forces couldn't match or counter. The operational tempo wasn't dramatic or overwhelming like American fast carrier task force operations, but it was relentless, professional, and incredibly difficult to disrupt. Commander Ian Robertson, Royal Navy liaison to American carrier forces, observed the growing American respect for British carrier resilience. Initially, American officers were skeptical of our capabilities, understandably, given our 1942 performance. But watching British carriers absorb kamikaze hits that would cripple their vessels and continue operating has generated genuine admiration. Admiral Mitcher remarked that if he could combine American striking power with British carrier survivability, he'd have the perfect carrier force. The comment reflected broader realization. Different carrier philosophies represented different strengths rather than superiority or inferiority. American carriers maximized offensive power, but were vulnerable to damage. British carriers sacrificed some striking power for survivability and sustained operations. Neither approach was wrong. They simply reflected different operational philosophies and strategic requirements. But Japanese planning had assumed British inferiority rather than British difference, and that assumption was costing Japanese forces dearly in the skies over Sakishima, May 4, 1945. The demonstration of British carrier resilience reached its apex when HMS Formidable and Indomitable absorbed multiple kamikaze hits in a single day. 9 successful strikes between the 2 carriers, attacks that would have destroyed American carriers twice over. Formidable took 4 kamikazes, including one that crashed through her flight deck armor, previously thought impossible. Indomitable absorbed 5 hits, including 3 in rapid succession, that turned her flight deck into an inferno visible for miles. American observers aboard nearby vessels assumed both British carriers were finished, already composing recommendations for rescue operations and discussing how to redistribute British air groups to American carriers. Instead, they witnessed something that fundamentally changed American understanding of carrier design philosophy. Both British carriers, despite horrific damage, maintained watertight integrity. Fires were controlled and extinguished using damage control procedures developed through years of Mediterranean combat against German and Italian air attack. Within hours, not days or weeks, Both carriers had cleared their flight decks, made temporary repairs, and resumed limited operations. Within 24 hours, both were conducting full strike operations as if the previous day's damage had never occurred. The performance was impossible by American carrier design standards, yet British carriers had achieved it through engineering philosophy that prioritized survivability over every other consideration. The armored flight decks that American designers dismissed as inefficient had prevented catastrophic damage. The closed hangar design that reduced air group size had contained fires and prevented them from spreading throughout the ship. The compartmentalized design that seemed overly complex had maintained watertight integrity, even with massive hull damage. Every inefficiency in British carrier design revealed itself as intentional design choice, optimizing for sustained combat operations rather than maximum striking power. Admiral Mitcher cabled Admiral Nimitz, British carrier damage control and survivability capabilities significantly exceed previous assessments. Recommend immediate study of British carrier design features for incorporation into future American carrier construction. Their armored flight deck concept, in particular, merits serious consideration despite weight penalties. The cable represented institutional humility rare in military organizations, acknowledgement that Allied designs incorporated wisdom American planning had missed. But for Japanese forces, the implications were far more dire. If kamikaze attacks, Japan's primary remaining naval warfare capability, couldn't neutralize British carriers, Japanese defensive options were rapidly approaching zero. The operational mathematics were brutal. British carriers could sustain operations indefinitely while absorbing damage that would eliminate Japanese defensive capabilities within weeks. Attrition warfare favored the side that could survive punishment, and British carriers had demonstrated survival capabilities that Japanese intelligence had insisted didn't exist. The final phase of Japanese confrontation with British carrier power came not in the Sakishima campaign but in British carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands in July 1945. Task Force 37, the redesignated British Pacific Fleet, joined American carrier forces in operations directly against Japan, and here the accumulated lessons of 4 years of British carrier evolution demonstrated their ultimate implications. British carriers struck targets that included Hitachi, Hokkaido, and the Tokyo area, operations deep in Japanese home waters, against targets defended by thousands of Japanese aircraft, through weather conditions that tested every aspect of carrier operational capability. The strikes revealed British carrier aviation at its most formidable. British pilots flying American aircraft but employing tactical doctrine refined through European and Pacific combat demonstrated capabilities that forced Japanese defensive planners to completely revise their threat assessments. Though by July 1945, such revisions were academic exercises disconnected from Japan's ability to implement effective countermeasures. British Corsairs and Avengers penetrated Japanese air defenses with precision strike coordination that equaled American performance while demonstrating British innovations. Night carrier operations that allowed strikes when Japanese defensive fighters were grounded. Weather flying capabilities that permitted operations in conditions American carriers found marginal. And perhaps most significantly, operational tempo that sustained continuous pressure regardless of weather, defensive response, or previous day's losses. Captain Yoshida Toshio, one of the few surviving senior Japanese naval aviators, monitored British carrier operations from shore installations and recognized what many of his superiors still refused to acknowledge. The British carrier force operating against our home islands bears no resemblance to the force we encountered in the Indian Ocean in 1942. These are modern carriers with excellent aircraft, skilled pilots, and operational doctrine specifically developed for Pacific warfare. Our intelligence services failed catastrophically in assessing British carrier aviation development. We planned for enemies we understood, American carriers. We encountered enemies we had dismissed as irrelevant, British carriers whose capabilities we never seriously studied. The failure is ultimately ours, not theirs. The admission came too late to matter operationally. By July 1945, Japanese naval aviation existed only in scattered, depleted units defending the home islands against overwhelming Allied air power. British carrier strikes were devastating not because British carriers were individually superior to American carriers, but because they represented additional combat power beyond what Japanese defensive planning had anticipated. Japan had prepared to defend against American carrier attack. They had not prepared to defend simultaneously against American and British carrier forces, whose combined operational capabilities exceeded Japanese defensive capacity, regardless of tactical skill or strategic commitment. The ultimate confrontation between Japanese confidence and British carrier reality came on July 24, 1945, when British carrier aircraft encountered and sank the Japanese escort carrier Shimane Maru off northern Honshu. The engagement itself was tactically unremarkable. 3 British Avengers from HMS Indefatigable delivered torpedo attacks against a Japanese carrier that had minimal defensive capability and couldn't escape. What made the engagement significant was psychological. British carrier aircraft had hunted and killed a Japanese carrier, inverting the relationship that Japanese doctrine had assumed would define any British-Japanese carrier confrontation. The symbolism was overwhelming. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war as the world's most formidable carrier force, had been reduced to watching helplessly as British carrier aircraft flying from carriers that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as obsolete 4 years earlier, operated with impunity in Japanese home waters, striking targets at will, sinking Japanese vessels including carriers, and demonstrating absolute operational superiority. The reversal was complete, the humiliation comprehensive, the lesson undeniable. But what lesson? For Japanese naval officers, the temptation was to attribute British carrier success to material superiority, more carriers, more aircraft, more resources, rather than to acknowledge the deeper failure, Japanese institutional arrogance that had dismissed British carrier aviation as inherently inferior rather than as temporarily disadvantaged in 1942, but capable of rapid improvement. Material superiority explained defeat without requiring uncomfortable self-examination about why Japanese intelligence assessments had been so comprehensively wrong for so long. Commander Yamada, watching from shore installations as British carrier aircraft struck nearby naval facilities, understood the deeper failure. We assumed European naval powers were declining and Asian naval powers were ascending. We interpreted temporary British weakness in 1942 as permanent British inferiority. We stopped studying British carrier development because we had concluded British carriers were irrelevant to Pacific warfare. Every assumption was wrong. The British were learning while we were celebrating. They adapted while we stagnated. They designed carriers for sustained warfare while we designed carriers for decisive battle. When sustained warfare came, their designs proved superior to ours. The recognition came too late to influence Japanese operations. By late July 1945, Japan had effectively lost all capability to conduct carrier operations, regardless of doctrine or design philosophy. But for post-war analysis and military historical study, the recognition would matter enormously. The Japanese-British carrier confrontation demonstrated how confidence could blind military organizations to Allied capabilities, how initial success could prevent necessary adaptation, and how institutional arrogance could persist even in the face of contradictory evidence until reality delivered lessons too painful to ignore. August 1945. British carriers continued operations against Japanese targets until the war's final days, their aircraft striking coastal installations, shipping, and defensive positions with the methodical efficiency that had characterized British carrier operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. When Japan surrendered on August 15th, British carrier aircraft were preparing strikes scheduled for the following day, strikes that would have been delivered with the same professional competence they had demonstrated for 18 months of Pacific operations. The post-war reckoning revealed the comprehensive nature of Japanese intelligence failure regarding British carrier capabilities. Assessment documents captured by Allied forces showed that Japanese naval intelligence had maintained 1942 evaluations of British carrier weakness essentially unchanged throughout the war. Reports that contradicted these evaluations, and there had been many from multiple sources, had been dismissed as anomalous, misinterpreted, or simply ignored. The institutional resistance to revising British capability assessments ran so deep that even after British carriers had demonstrated their survivability, their operational tempo, and their strike capabilities through 18 months of combat operations, Japanese intelligence summaries still characterized British carriers as inferior to American carriers and secondary threats to Japanese defensive operations. The failure wasn't primarily about intelligence collection. Japanese observers had access to considerable information about British carrier operations. The failure was analytical. Japanese intelligence services told their commanders what commanders wanted to hear rather than what evidence suggested. Commanders wanted to hear that Japanese forces faced American carriers, but not serious British carrier threats. Intelligence services provided assessments confirming that preference, even as British carriers demonstrated capabilities that contradicted every element of those assessments. For British carrier aviation, the Pacific Campaign represented comprehensive vindication. The force that had been dismissed as obsolete in 1942 had returned in 1945 as a formidable instrument of naval power, designed differently than American carriers but no less effective, operating with tactical doctrine refined through years of combat, demonstrating engineering excellence that American observers increasingly recognized as superior to American carrier design in crucial aspects, particularly survivability and sustained operations capability. Admiral Fraser, reviewing British Pacific Fleet operations after the surrender, noted with understated satisfaction, "We were told our carriers were obsolete. We were advised to accept secondary roles. We were offered assignments that would have kept us distant from primary combat operations. Instead, we insisted on operational equality. We demonstrated our capabilities through performance, and we finished the war with British carrier aircraft operating over Japanese home islands, exactly as American carrier aircraft operated, striking targets, sinking ships, winning battles. Our carriers proved what they were: modern, capable, and thoroughly effective instruments of naval warfare. The Japanese learned this truth. Some of our allies learned it as well. The moment of complete recognition came not during combat, but in the post-war assessment conducted by the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, tasked with evaluating Japanese military capabilities and understanding why Japanese defensive planning had failed so comprehensively. The mission's interviews with surviving Japanese naval officers revealed a pattern of institutional failure that transcended any single tactical or technical shortcoming. Japanese naval planning had simply dismissed British carrier aviation as strategically irrelevant based on 1942 performance, then had never seriously revisited that assessment, even as evidence accumulated that British carriers had undergone fundamental transformation. Captain Fuchida Mitsuo, the Pearl Harbor strike leader who survived the war, testified with remarkable candor, "We defeated the British Eastern Fleet in 1942, and from that moment forward, we stopped thinking about British carriers as serious threats. Every intelligence briefing, every operational plan, every tactical discussion assumed our carrier opponents would be Americans. We planned for American fast carrier task forces. We developed tactics against American carrier operations. We designed weapons to destroy American carriers. When British carriers arrived in 1945, we discovered they operated differently, survived differently, fought differently than the American carriers we had prepared for. By then, it was too late to adapt." The admission contained layers of failure. Tactical failure. Japanese forces had prepared for the wrong enemy. Intelligence failure. Japanese assessment systems had rejected data contradicting preferred conclusions. Institutional failure. Japanese naval culture had stopped learning after early successes. But deepest was psychological failure. Japanese confidence in their own superiority had prevented serious study of British carrier development, because such study required acknowledging that European naval powers might still have lessons to teach Asian naval powers. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the technical mission's findings, observed, "The Japanese assumed British decline was permanent and comprehensive. They interpreted temporary British weakness as inherent British inferiority. They stopped studying an opponent they had decided wasn't worth studying. The result was that when British carriers returned to the Pacific, Japanese forces encountered enemies they hadn't prepared for, operating capabilities Japanese intelligence insisted didn't exist, demonstrating engineering and tactical sophistication that Japanese doctrine had dismissed as impossible. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. The lesson resonated beyond the Pacific War's specific circumstances. Military organizations that stop learning from potential opponents, that dismiss allied capabilities based on temporary conditions, that allow confidence to override evidence. These organizations prepare themselves for defeat, regardless of temporary advantages in technology, personnel, or resources. The Japanese had learned this truth at immense cost. The question was whether other military organizations would learn from Japan's example, or would need to learn the same lesson through their own painful experience. 80 years after British carriers struck the Japanese home islands, The Pacific Carrier Campaign remains a study in how institutional assumptions shape military outcomes more profoundly than technology or tactics. The British Fleet Air Arm that Japanese naval intelligence dismissed in 1941 as ceremonially obsolete ended the war demonstrating carrier capabilities that influenced American carrier design for decades afterward. The armored flight deck concept that American naval architects initially dismissed as inefficient became standard in British carrier construction and influenced post-war American carrier designs. The operational doctrine emphasizing survivability and sustained operations rather than maximum striking power proved prescient for the grinding attrition warfare that characterized Pacific operations from 1943 onward. What Japanese forces never fully grasped, what their confidence prevented them from understanding, was that Britain had been learning continuously since 1939. Every Mediterranean carrier operation, every convoy battle, every engagement against German and Italian air power had refined British carrier doctrine. The lessons had been expensive, paid for in ships sunk and lives lost, but they had been learned thoroughly. By 1945, British carrier aviation represented matured combat capability, developed through 6 years of continuous warfare against first-rate opponents. Japanese forces, conversely, had peaked in 1942 and spent 3 years bleeding irreplaceable pilots and carriers in attritional campaigns that prevented doctrinal evolution. The legacy endures in modern naval aviation doctrine, which emphasizes exactly the qualities British carriers demonstrated: survivability, sustained operations, capability to function through adverse conditions, damage control excellence. Modern carrier design philosophy reflects British influence more than Japanese influence precisely because British carriers were designed for prolonged warfare rather than decisive battle. And modern naval warfare, like World War II Pacific warfare, has proven to be prolonged rather than decisive. For students of military history, the Japanese-British carrier confrontation offers enduring lessons about institutional learning, intelligence assessment, and the dangers of allowing confidence to override evidence. The price of dismissing opponents based on assumption rather than analysis is always paid by the forces that must fight with inadequate preparation against enemies they never seriously studied. The British Fleet Air Arm, dismissed and underestimated, demonstrated what serious professional military organizations achieve when they learn continuously, adapt thoroughly, and design for warfare's reality rather than warfare's theory. The Japanese, brilliant in 1941 and comprehensively defeated by 1945, demonstrated what happens when organizations stop learning and start celebrating. Both lessons remain relevant to every military organization that must prepare for future conflict while learning from past experience, which is to say, every military organization that hopes to survive war's unforgiving test of competence.